Welcome to the Church and Family Life Podcast. Today we've got with us Tom Ascol. We're going to talk about Christian nationalism, the ups, the downs, the controversies, and the agreements, and some suggestions. I hope you enjoy the discussion. Jason, for quite a while, the big blow up, on the internet, Twitter, on the Twitter sphere has been Christian nationalism. So it's great to have Tom Ascol on with us. He just wrote this book, The Perils and Promises of Christian Nationalism. Love the book. Wanted to have him on to talk about it. Of course, because, his view is my view. So there you have it.
Let's start also by just commending on YouTube by the same title, "The Perils and Promise of Christian Nationalism." You'll find a message by Tom Ascol, which I'm assuming there's lots of crossover in content there. So found that very helpful.
Yeah, thank you. That's right. And this little booklet came out of that talk, and so I was able to elaborate a little bit on some of the things that I did. That talk was a part of a pre-conference that I did with Vodi Balcom before the National Founders Conference 2 years ago, I think. He and I were discussing, what should we do on this, couple hours that we have before the conference officially kicks off. And people were hot and heavy beginning to talk about Christian nationalism. We said, okay, well, let's do a pre-conference on Christian nationalism. So that's what we called it. We didn't say we were for it or we were against it. And once we announced it, probably 6 or 7 months before the conference, I started getting emails and direct messages and texts and phone calls saying, I can't believe you're a Christian nationalist. Why would you be for this? And other people saying, how can you be against Christian nationalism? It's terrible. And we hadn't said one thing, either pro or con, but it was a commentary on just the kind of volatile issue that it has been. And people immediately line up on one side or the other, largely based upon presuppositions and what they've experienced or heard. And then they start responding to that. And a lot of people, even some really good brothers, are talking past one another on this subject. And so I'm glad we dealt with it. And then out of that, it just seemed fitting to try to put some of my thoughts in writing in this little booklet. So that's how that came to be.
Yeah, Tom, could you talk a little bit about some of the different ways that the term Christian nationalism has been used? Because, my thought all along is, what do you mean by Christian nationalism? It's this term that can mean almost anything. So could you just talk about the different ways that this term is used?
Yeah, well, it's used to defend everything from, as Lauren Boebert, I think she's the congresswoman from Colorado, says, there have only been 2 special nations ever in the history of the world. That's Israel and the United States, and they're both special to God. Others have said that America is a nation in covenant with God, or that America has something beyond a sense of God's of the role in God's kingdom beyond other nations. And so anything like that sees America as having a place specifically in God's redemptive history that's on par with or maybe supersedes Israel in the Old Covenant era. I have great problems with that, but some people will have that mentality when they talk about Christian nationalism. This makes us Christian nationalists. Others have said, well, Christian nationalism is just another expression of white supremacy and heteronormativity and all of the things that we find offensive in our postmodern age that is riddled with Marxist ideologies. And so Christian nationalism becomes this almost wax nose that gets put on the face of anything that you want to be opposed to. So there's a lot of bad stuff that has flown under the banner of Christian nationalism, both by critics as well as some who would openly identify themselves as proponents. And I reject the worst, both of those extreme camps. I think that's a wrong way to think about this issue.
In your book, you say that this is a play run by progressives. Of course, you're talking about this view, that it's a white supremacy, heteronormativity thing.
Yeah.
Talk to us about that. How is it a play run by progressives?
Yeah, well, the reason that I come to that, and it's a speculation, but it's a theory, I would call it, and I'm open for people to debate it. But you look at the people who 5 years ago and beyond and since were coming out advocating critical race theory, white fragility, intersectionality, anti-racism, all of this stuff that we tried to call attention to and say, man, this is bad. This is Marxism. Don't let this into your churches. 2019, the Southern Baptist Convention adopted a resolution affirming critical race theory and intersectionality over the protests of a few of us who were trying to keep that from happening. So that's 5 years ago. Now you fast forward today. Who are the people that are coming out guns blazing against Christian nationalism as they define it? It's the same people that were promoting the critical race theory and intersectionality. And so, what I believe, at least is a good theory to consider, is has now that we're in a time when no self respecting evangelical will say, oh, yeah, I think critical race theory is a great thing, or I think intersectionality is a great thing, because that has been completely debunked. And by God's grace, enough light has been shed for
Mhm.
thinking Christians to realize, no, 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 that's a bad idea. Well, now it's Christian nationalism. These are the guys that want to pretend that America is somehow an inherently covenanted nation before God, and they're driving all their ideology. They're more political than Christian. All of the accusations that have been made, and trying to silence Christians from saying things that, up until 10 minutes ago, thoughtful conservative Christians were saying throughout the history of this nation
Mhm.
and before. So I do think that it's a similar play by the same people who lost the ability to use the kind of language and strategies that they had up until a few years ago.
When I watched your message, I thought it was really interesting and helpful that you found a definition of Christian nationalism that was actually embraced both by an advocate and by an opponent. So that's
Yeah.
usually a good starting point. Can you just kind of bring us into that definition that both the advocates and opponents sort of can settle on?
Yeah, Paul Miller who's a strong critic of Christian nationalism, wrote this book called "The Religion of American Greatness: What's Wrong with Christian Nationalism," and he gives a three-part definition that he settles on. And so he's an opponent of Christian nationalism, and he's opponent of what he defines as this. Let me just read it to you. He says, "This is what it means. Christian nationalism asserts that there is something identifiable as a Christian nation, distinct from other nations, that American nationhood is and should remain defined by Christianity or Christian cultural norms, and that the American people and their government should actively work to defend, sustain, and cultivate America's Christian culture, heritage, and values." So, first of all, there's such a thing as an American nation, and that America was founded on the basis of Christian values or cultural norms. And thirdly, that Christians in America today should work for the maintenance of those values and norms, and should call upon their government to do that as well. Well, he's a critic. I mean, he's saying that's the definition, and we shouldn't do that as Christians. I mean, this guy used to be I think, a fellow in the ERLC, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. He's a well-respected evangelical Southern Baptist. And I look at that definition, I say, that's a good definition. I'm for that.
Mhm. Mm.
I think those things, again, until not too many years ago, would have just been common sense for most conservative American evangelicals. So I think it's a good definition to work with, and to begin to make sense of where our real differences lie. And in this instance, I have real differences with Paul Miller on this and his vision of political theology, and how we ought to engage it as conservative evangelical Christians. And mine, we're on different pages, and I'm okay with that. We can have a good conversation, at least agreeing on the definition.
One of the elements of the debate was the use of the law of God in government, and this is where I found our confession very, very helpful, because it speaks very directly to it. I was really amazed. A decade and a half ago, I preached through the book of Deuteronomy. It was one of the most helpful things to me, just to see the applicability of the law of God. And Jesus quotes from Deuteronomy more than any other book. Jesus loved the book of Deuteronomy. But what struck me as I was moving through the case laws is how many of our laws currently come right out of Deuteronomy. In other words, the discussion was, should we have Christian laws? Well, we already do have Christian laws. So what are you going to do with that? But I'd like to just talk about the matter of biblical law in the government, because our confession speaks very clearly. When I have an intern group, I always make them memorize that chapter on the law because it's so clarifying. It'll help them for the next 50 years, to think it through. But let's talk about the law of God in government. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, what you said in chapter 19 of the confession, it's a great, great chapter to study the law. And what I tell guys is you have got to come to terms with what the New Testament and the Old Testament, but especially the New Testament, means by law.
Mm-hmm.
If you only have one definition, you think every time the word law shows up that it's talking about the same thing, you're going to go off the rails. You won't get past Romans 2 before you'll be tied up in knots, because there are different understandings of the law. And historically, coming out of at least the Middle Ages with Aquinas, and then certainly into the Reformers, Calvin and others, the threefold division of the law, which is in our confession, has been recognized as a helpful way to distinguish between law and law in the Bible. So what do we have? We've got the ceremonial law, the civil law, and the moral law. God gave laws to his old covenant people as a worshiping community. Those are ceremonial laws that governed how they worshiped him. He gave laws to his old covenant community as a body politic, and that is the civil case laws that you referred to. But he also gave laws to his old covenant people as people made in his image. And so we're no longer a geopolitical entity in the kingdom of God. We no longer worship under the old covenant because we're new covenant believers, but we're still people made in the image of God. So the moral law of God still obtains. And I love the way the confession puts it, that the civil laws are no longer obligatory, or maybe it says that are abolished, except to the degree that the general equity that is found within them. And so what is that referring to? It's the same thing you just mentioned. Where there's righteousness found in those Old Testament case laws, then we ought to take that and apply it in our modern age, in every place. And one of the clear examples is in the Old Testament. You had the law of you had to have a parapet around your roof so that people on your roof wouldn't easily fall off. Well, you don't want to take that and just drop it into Cape Coral, Florida, or Winston-Salem, North Carolina. If you do that, that's going to be problematic, because our roofs are mostly slanted, and so not many people are walking on them. But is there general equity in that? Yeah. Put a fence around your swimming pool, or mitigate dangers that might exist in the normal course of life around your home. And so understanding that we're still governed by the moral law of God, and that there's wisdom in trying to mine the equity, the general equity in those Old Testament civil laws and apply them. That's how America law has been developed, and it's been good for us.
Hey, I want to quote paragraph 4 in the confession. You were paraphrasing it very well, but I want to just read it because it's so clarifying. And paragraph 4 focuses on the most controversial question, and that's about the judicial laws. Not a lot of controversy over the moral law, not a lot of controversy over the ceremonial law. It's the judicial law that really takes the heat. And so the confession reads this: to them also he gave sundry judicial laws which expired together with the state of that people, not obliging any now by virtue of that institution, their general equity only being of moral use. Meaning the judicial laws are of moral use. They contain principles. And every law of God represents the character of God. Every law of God is a law of love, and it's it's disappointing when you find people who say, well, I don't like that law.
Yeah.
You read Deuteronomy, and some of them, they really reveal your own lack of justice and your own lack of love. If you don't like a law of God, there's something wrong with you, not with that law. But, this general equity principle is so critical. And I felt like that got lost in a lot of the Christian nationalism discussion when people were saying, oh, we're going to have a theocracy. Well, neither the Westminster Confession or the Baptist Confession contend for that.
Tom, let me say a phrase and just let you run with it. Myth of neutrality.
Okay.
Myth of neutrality.
Yeah, that's right. We have had exposed to us in no uncertain terms just how deeply embedded in American psychology or the psyche of Americans, and sadly, too many American evangelicals, this idea of Enlightenment liberalism, that we are a pluralistic society, that everything's neutral, that we don't want any kind of religious advantage being given, and so we've even been misled about religious liberty, that religious liberty means that all religions need to be treated equal. That is not what even our Baptist forefathers meant, and when America was being founded. It's not what the Danbury Baptists meant when they corresponded with Thomas Jefferson. There is no neutrality. It is indeed a myth. You're going to worship someone. Somebody's going to determine some principle, some transcendental reality is going to determine what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad, how we should live our lives. And of course, knowing God through faith in Jesus Christ, the only proper source of that is God himself. And I would go on to underscore, I've told this to atheist friends of mine and to those who have been radically opposed to the idea that we ought to have a nation that honors the Lord, whose laws reflect the righteousness of God.
Mm-hmm.
You better hope that biblical Christianity reigns supreme, because if it doesn't, then atheists, you're just going to survive only to the degree that you're strong enough to withstand what's coming. Try that in an Islamic republic. If you're an atheist or if you're a homosexual and you go to an Islamic republic and you try to live your life openly like that, you're not going to have any religious liberty. Why? Because religious liberty is a fruit of biblical Christianity. And where you destroy biblical Christianity, you're not going to have religious liberty. So, yes, we want a nation whose laws reflect the righteousness of the only God who is. I mean, thou shalt not murder. That's a Christian law. Paul cites it in Romans 13, elsewhere. Do we not want laws that reflect the righteousness of God? We all do. Even those who hate God, if they're thinking right about it, will have to admit, yeah, we want laws that are built upon righteousness.
I was struck by what you were saying. There are superior cultures, and superior cultures are built by superior laws. And it just made me think of where we live. You live in Florida, we're in North Carolina. The indigenous peoples, that were ruling and reigning in our regions were eating one another. They were running around naked. They were putting grease on themselves to keep warm. They were raiding one another. And by the way, I don't recall the last time Cape Coral was raided by a tribe. In other words, but
Right.
That's because of the law of God. The Puritans came here and they established a basic fundamental Christian ethics in law. And that's why the American government still maintains biblical laws, and we've created a superior culture. There are particular ways that American culture is superior to other cultures in the world. Now we see the degradation of that. We're certainly not saying that American culture is perfect or anything, not anything like that. But laws create culture, and for people who say we don't really want God's law and government, have not carefully thought through what the law of God actually is, and particularly confessional view of the law. That's what kind of frustrated me in this whole discussion about should we have Christian laws or not. I'm thinking paragraph 4 of the 1689
Mhm.
Confession on the Law, that's where you should go.
Yeah. Amen.
A point from your message that I found really helpful was the point that secularism is not free from any religious influence. It is itself a religion, and it's simply a competing religion. So secularism really gets a free pass as if it's this neutral party. Going back to the topic of neutrality, it is no neutral party. It is a competing religion.
Hmm. Amen. And we're seeing that more and more because the masks are coming off
Mm-hmm.
and the walls are coming down. When we were living in a time where there were still uh, these notable threads in our culture that were tied to biblical Christianity, well, okay, secularism kind of maintained a place that wasn't as aggressive and as openly pagan as it is now. Well, now that those threads have been pulled out and it's almost anything goes, you're seeing the real face of the so-called secularism. It is nothing but neo-paganism. And just go to Drag Queen Story Hour, or show up at one of these pride events in the month of June, and that's your secularism. And it grieves me whenever Christians, David French said this, that yes, Drag Queen Story Hour is just a blessing of liberty. It's a blessing that he is. If he'd have said that 100 years ago, you maybe could have understood it better, but there wouldn't have been a Drag Queen Story
Mm-hmm.
Hour then, because those people would have been arrested, and rightly so, and put in jail. There is no neutrality. The only question is, who are you going to serve, and what God is going to be honored in how the culture is guided, informed, and shaped by its laws.
Amen. Okay, with just a couple minutes left here, Tom, the firestorm has been raging. It's kind of evening out a little bit. Books have been written. Men have clarified their views. What's your view from the bridge right now on these various streams of controversy over Christian nationalism?
Yeah. Well, there are kooks on both sides. And so I think we just let the kooks duke it out among themselves. But I want to say to brothers like us, because we have confessional brothers that have really almost drawn swords on each other over this issue. And it grieves me. And I would love to see, let's get 15 or 20 of us in a room and put our cell phones away, lock the doors until we remember how much we have in common and what we agree on before we come out, because those who have been most outspoken anti-Christian nationalists, they've been reacting to some
Mm-hmm.
extremes. And those who have been some of the most strongly vocal Christian nationalists, I think they also have been responding to extremes over there. I don't know any 1689 anti-Christian nationalist that doesn't want a godly government.
Mm-hmm.
They all
Right.
they all do. They're just nervous maybe about how it's been said. I don't know any 1689 Christian nationalist, self-described, that wants an Old Testament theocracy.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what they want. And I think if we could get in a room and quit talking past one another, we'd realize, okay, we agree on about 90% of the issues here that we've been debating without really making much contact on each other's minds. So I would love to see that happen. I think it could be a fruitful conversation.
I've felt like there's a lot more overlap and agreement on a lot more now than at the beginning of this firestorm, because I think you do have men who really love their Bibles and want to
Yeah.
do the will of God. So, well, Tom, thank you so much.
Amen.
Thank you
I agree.
for writing this book. I really appreciate it. And hey, maybe you can get those guys together. It'll be a great time.
That'd be wonderful, wouldn't it, if we could do
Yeah.
that? Yeah, maybe
Well,
laugh.
yeah, and maybe it's just preparation for, everybody to be in prison together, praising God for God's law.
That's right. We'll have time then.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it.
Thank you, brothers.
And thank you for joining us on the Church and Family Life podcast. Hope you can join us next time. And don't forget to pick up Tom's book, The Perils and Promises of Christian Nationalism.
Church and Family Life is proclaiming the sufficiency of Scripture by helping build strong families and strong churches. If you found this resource helpful, we encourage you to check out churchandfamilylife.com.